Green Interview first talked with Elizabeth May back at the beginning of our project in 2009. At that point, she was leader of Canada's Green Party, but the party had no seats in Parliament. Stephen Harper had a minority Conservative government, and Elizabeth was focused on the make-or-break climate negotiations to be held that December in Copenhagen. She had also published a book on her experiences thus far in politics, Losing Confidence: Power, Politics, and the Crisis in Canadian Democracy. A lot changes in 2 years. Elizabeth is now Canada's first Green Member of Parliament. Stephen Harper heads a majority government, and progress on climate change seems as elusive as ever. We asked her to join us again for our first update interview, and we're delighted that she could find the time to talk with us again.
Well, on election night, I can tell you it felt overwhelmingly like bad news, which is, a surprise to people because, of course, it was phenomenal to win in Saanich Gulf Islands. The voters were wonderful. We had, by a lot of markers, just a tremendous campaign. I don't know if you know, we had 75% voter turnout in Saanich Gulf Islands. It's the highest of any riding except one in PEI. So across Canada, and it was always a riding that had high levels of voter participation. In 2008, it was 70% voter turnout. We went 75% voter turnout, and I won by a really large margin. So over, I think it was 43% of the vote, and Gary Lunn, who'd been the member before, was at 35%. So it was a quite strong victory. So I should have been over the moon happy, but the reality of seeing a majority, as I said that night in my acceptance speech, this was a false majority. This was 39% of the popular vote of the 60% of Canadians who voted. So, a false majority, but a majority government nonetheless, which, as I felt, a combination of, more condemned than celebratory, thinking of the next 4 years at least of sitting in the House of Commons, facing government benches that are overflowing. Actually, some of the government members have to sit on the other side of the House amongst the opposition because there are more of them than fit on the government benches. They have a majority of seats and they can put through anything on the agenda. And I knew enough about the Stephen Harper's agenda to be more devastated for the country than I could feel, happy for the Green Party or me personally. It took a couple of days adjustment to figure out, what does this mean? How am I going to make a difference in this context? Because our entire campaign, my message to voters about what I could do in the House of Commons as an individual MP was premised on what I could do in a minority government, in a parliament where opposition parties had the majority of seats. And I'd been on the sidelines, actually in the diplomatic gallery, watching Parliament for years, and frustrated by thinking, well, they've got the majority of the votes down there. The opposition members could do so much that they're not doing, and if I could get in there, maybe we can figure out better ways to work together. And all the chances, and just heartbreaking, the number of chances that just slipped through their fingers when they had Stephen Harper in a minority situation. And I was facing a very different calculation. I mean, it was a shocking election in many ways for Michael Ignatieff to lose his own seat, Gilles Duceppe to lose his own seat. And I, looked at this and thought, all right, so there's got to be something that I can bring to this that others can't. And I'm quite confident that I'm finding the way through to do things that others can't.
Well, you found a number of ways to sort of leverage your position as a single MP. And,
yeah.
And tell me how you've managed to do that.
Well, my first thought of the way through facing a majority was to learn all the rules. That if there was going to be any way in which we could make a difference as Greens, and with my sole seat, I'm not using the royal we, but there are a lot of Greens across Canada. We had, even despite being kept out of the leaders' debates and not really being included in national media at all, we did quite well in terms of our national vote. Because really, given how little coverage we had, it's a miracle that we had anything left of a national vote. But our candidates were great. We ran good campaigns, and that we, when I use it, refers to the Greens across the country. So I sometimes say to people, I have a really large caucus. It's just that I'm the only one who's been elected yet. So, I have a shadow cabinet. We have lots of Greens across the country who are active and working together. But I thought, the only way to get traction in a situation where might makes right and Harper has the votes is to make sure that we don't lose any procedural advantage. So I spent a lot of time immediately upon winning the election reading through the real arcane levels of parliamentary rules of procedure to make sure that there's no opportunity that's potentially there that we would miss. And that is making a difference. So finding out, I've always believed, and I wrote about it in my last book, that Canadian parliamentary democracy means that every member of parliament has power. In the same way that I believe that every voter, every citizen has power, surely every member of parliament, as of right, there are things you can do as a member of parliament. The reason that most voters don't think of members of parliament on an individual basis having any power is that all the other members of parliament are in established top-down political parties. And you might like the direction that one leader takes over the direction another leader takes, but the reality for the members of parliament near the bottom of that pyramid is that you do what you're told. If you want to succeed in that party, if you want to progress, if your career wants to go well, you do what you're told. So you sit down when you're told, you shut up when you're told, and so on. So that means that voters are not used to seeing that an individual member of parliament can do a lot. I can, introduce petitions every day. I can make points of order anytime. I have one question a week in question period, which is not bad. Make member statements, but I can also stand up on any issue in debate and put forward comments and questions. And I can introduce amendments to all government legislation in the report stage. So there's quite a long list of, and as of right, I can go into any parliamentary committee and sit at the table, and there's the potential for being able to ask witnesses questions, but so far none of the committee chairs have allowed me to ask any witnesses questions.
In addition, you also have a team of interns that are, in a sense, giving you extra arms, legs, eyes, and ears in all those committees.
Right. So I should mention, because I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, that we also have a really terrific team in Saanich Gulf Islands doing constituency work. The hardest part of my job as a member of parliament has been the constituency work because it's so heartbreaking. So many appalling, just Kafkaesque immigration decisions, keeping families split apart, or decisions on people's pensions. So we're advocating for individuals in my riding, and that's a big part of my workload too. But no, I'm finding that really on Parliament Hill, we are essentially a little, I don't like to use military metaphors, but nothing comes to mind as much as a little green army. I've got my chief of staff and my director of communications and a legislative director. No single MP has a chief of staff. That's what you have when you're leader of a party with a big caucus. So some of the folks on the Hill did a double take when they realized, well, she has a chief of staff. But I'm stretching a limited budget as far as I can, and I have 12 interns. And so some of them have some kind of compensation. Most of them are volunteer, master's level students in political science or in fisheries policy or whatever, and matching them up with the committees in which they have an interest. And then that's a way of expanding my ability to keep, to stay aware of what's going on in a lot of different areas all at once, prepare legislation, when it's a good time to go into those committees to participate. Well, as I said, try to ask questions, maybe get shot down, but at least hear the witnesses and take stock of the temperature in the room, see what's going on. So I'm trying to be as fully engaged on all policy issues as I believe a leader of an opposition party should be.
That's quite an astonishing, you must give the impression of popping up at the crucial moment in all kinds of committees, as though you had some sort of sixth sense. Right?
Well, I don't know how many of them have noticed it yet, but they may be in fact noticing it. I do have the Justice Committee, and there was a special ad hoc committee to interview the two candidates for the Supreme Court. It was an amazing hearing and fascinating, and it's a very special privilege, frankly, to listen to two eminent jurists who are going to be going to the Supreme Court of Canada. And I wanted to get my sense so that I could go back to Saanich Gulf Islands or as leader of the party federally. If people say, well, how do you feel about these appointees? I wanted to be quite confident. And I can say quite confidently, I think they'll be wonderful at the Supreme Court of Canada. I think these appointments that Stephen Harper chose, very good choices, very fine people. So getting that first-hand read is really important. So yes, you're right, I do show up at committee, and it's a wonderful thing to know that I have the absolute right. They may not, I can tell you from the look on their faces sometimes, the government benches don't like it when I show up, but I can take my seat at the table. Whether I'm allowed to ask a question or not is always up to the chair. And so far, I haven't had any luck getting to ask questions.
But they also know that you know what's been going on in that committee.
That's right.
Which in itself has got to have some small effect.
Well, it does, and it also means that to the extent that the media are in those committees, if they want to get a response afterwards and talk to someone who's knowledgeable, the media will tend to ask me questions after a committee hearing is over, even if the chair of the committee has shot me down. Actually, one of the funnier things that happened was that it didn't look like any media was in a committee in June, and I'd refuse. This is a place where I have a lot of power, is they ask for, quite often, motions by unanimous consent. When we started in June in the House of Commons, they were ignoring checking with me. So the government whip would check with the official opposition, the NDP, check with the Liberal Party, and then proceed to say we have unanimous consent. And if they didn't check with me, and if I believed it was a bad thing, I'd say, no, you don't. Because unanimous consent is what it sounds like. It's all 308 MPs say, yes, we all allow that to go forward. So when the mega trials bill came forward, now this is a bill where the general object and purpose of the bill I think is sensible, which is that when you have complex trials and say you generally organized crime or terrorist groups where say a dozen people or more are being charged with assorted offenses, and getting them through the judicial system without depriving them of their rights through delay is the problem. And during the election campaign, the Quebec courts released a whole bunch of Hell's Angels because they said these guys have been waiting for trial too long. It constitutes an abuse of their rights. So suddenly this mega trials bill that had been introduced in the fall of 2010 without ever making it to a committee hearing, without ever having a single witness on it, suddenly in June 2011, this is an urgent crisis, and all the parties said, we have to give unanimous consent. We have to pass this bill without having any hearings. I read the bill, and it needed work. There were mistakes. I said, well, no, you have to have hearings. You have to have witnesses. I called Clayton Ruby, whom I regard as, obviously one of Canada's leading criminal lawyers. He'd never heard of the bill, and I sent it to him, and he said, oh, no, you've got to change this and this and this. So to make a long story short, I was able to force hearings, and I brought things that I thought should be changed to the committee hearing. And they didn't think there was any media in the room, so I asked if I could speak, and sadly, both the Conservatives and the NDP said, no, she's not allowed to talk. Well, Katie O'Malley, she of the Rapid Thumbs, who tweets, live tweets and live blogs from committee hearings, was watching it on television because it was being broadcast. So she was writing, well, Elizabeth may force these hearings, but they're not going to let her talk. And then so she was recounting all of the blow by blow of how this committee went down. So in the end, it was known to Canadians what I was trying to say. I continued to try to get my oar in, and at the end of the whole thing, and they wouldn't let me talk, they said, we have clause by clause, and we don't want to delay. Clause by clause, we have to move. Well, they moved through clause by clause, I think in less than a half an hour for the whole bill, because they refused to allow any changes. And it was just rubber stamped all the way through. And when it was over, I mean, the kinds of things that were wrong with the bill, by the way, they left out the definition section. There's no definition of mega trials. So you could you could be a clever criminal court lawyer and go to the judge at the Superior Court and say, look, my trial, I want to move to the mega trial process because my client is facing 18 different charges and it's complicated, so I want to move to that process and not this process. Well, there'd be no way in the legislation to say, well, it wasn't meant to apply to you. It's meant to apply to these other groups of, So there's no definition section. They failed to make sure that they created a new position called a case management judge, but they forgot to amend the appeal section, so there's no way to appeal a decision of the case management judge because it's a category that doesn't exist in the appeal section. I mean, these are housekeeping amendments that shouldn't have been controversial. And then there were some other substantive things. They didn't want any of that done. So when I spoke, I said to the chair, now that we're through clause by clause, may I say something? And the chair said, oh, all right. Because they still had time left in their hearing. They'd rushed through everything so fast. And I said, I just wanted to say to the committee that especially since the Canadian Bar Association has recommended that this bill would not reach its objects in the way it's drafted. And now that you've passed it unchanged, I'd urge you to come back to it in the fall and consider amendments so that you can make sure the bill will achieve its objects. At which point some of the conservative MPs said, this is outrageous. And one person said, it's egregious that this observer should criticize us once we've just finished passing the bill. And while certainly not want her to be allowed to speak again. And I said, well, I was pretty sure I wasn't going to be allowed to anyway. Meanwhile, Katie O'Malley's recording this whole conversation and broadcasting it to everyone who reads CBC blogs. So I thought, well, it's grim to go into a hearing and not be allowed to say anything. But I hope they'll listen, and I hope they'll go back and amend that law, because they shouldn't have passed it without a single change. But again, that's probably where I have the single largest clout, is if I find out about, and sometimes they do these unanimous consent motions without checking with me, which is one reason I try not to leave the House at all for all the hours that the House is sitting. I try to be there, because you don't give notice of unanimous consent. If I'm there and able to pay attention, I can stop them on all kinds of things, because these unanimous, I mean, it's sad that the Conservatives have the ability to get the NDP and the Liberals to sign on to so much, but it's a unique level of power for the individual MP, and I don't use it very often, and I only do it when I think there's something, I agree to many unanimous consent motions. I don't object to them for the sake of objecting. But if there's something I can't support, I have that ability to stop them from making something go through by unanimous consent. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I can see that. I can see that there's a certain sense in which you're kind of finding the rules of guerrilla war, right?
Yes.
Parliamentary guerrilla war, in effect.
Parliamentary procedure is full of aspects of respect for the institutions. I mean, part of the problem is, of course, the reason we had the election was contempt for Parliament from the Harper government on the Afghan detainee documents. Well, that's another good example. In June, we went to an election over contempt and the Afghan detainee documents, and it didn't get much attention, but in June, John Baird announced, well, here's the documents from the first phase. I mean, you'll probably recall there was a compromise. To refresh viewers' memories, there was the charge that Canada was handing over people who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time to Afghan authorities, where it was almost certain that they were going to be tortured. And the Harper government refused to allow these documents into the hands of MPs. They said, we're at war, we don't share this information with the opposition parties, which is, look at Winston Churchill, who throughout the Second World War, all the opposition parties saw everything. Because you're at war, you actually share more. You don't assume that that you're more secretive, and you show contempt for Parliament. So anyway, the compromise that was, Peter Milliken, as the former Speaker, issued a ruling that the Harper government had shown contempt for Parliament on a prima facie case basis, that the government did not have the right to keep documents from parliamentarians. And so he gave them a limited amount of time to sort it out. And what they sorted out was a committee of MPs plus some retired judges to review all the documents and then report to Parliament. So they could take out the ones that might be strategic or in any way expose our allies to risk. So, I'm trying to make a long story short. In June, John Baird announced, here we go, first phase of their report, the first 4,000 pages of documents released out of some 30,000 documents. And the judges clearly in the covering letter said, we want to continue doing this work. It's not done yet, but we understand the government will not let us continue to do the work. So this is our last report. And John Baird said to the public and the media, look, this process so far has cost us $12 million. That's all we're going to spend. That's all the documents you get. That's over then. And it was largely swallowed by everyone. I'm thinking, what? We went to an election over contempt because the Harper government wouldn't reveal these documents. And now we've gotten the first tranche, heavily redacted, lots of crossed out bits, and we're not going to see any more. And the judges that were brought into this, Mr. Justice Iacobucci, to name one, said, look, this process isn't over. And so what do? I'm one MP. Well, I've filed a request for all the Afghan detainee documents all over again, because all of the contempt rulings of Peter Milliken died when the government fell in March 2011. So I'm trying to raise it again because it's pretty important that Parliament be respected and that these documents be produced. So we'll see what happens.
But Yeah, you're right. One MP makes a real difference in a situation like that.
I'm hoping so.
Yeah. And you've also found some ways to work across party lines on some issues that are of interest that are not necessarily on the government's agenda, but are on the agenda of individuals. Huh?
I'm a big believer in nonpartisan, cross-partisan, pan-partisan work. When I worked in the Mulroney government, although I wasn't a conservative, I worked with, you'll recall, I worked for Tom McMillan, who was Minister of Environment, 86 to 88 was my time working with him. And in those days, there was great cross-party cooperation. I mean, to get the South Moresby National Park, which is now Guyahanas National Park, on the southern third of Haida Gwaii, which used to be called the Queen Charlotte Islands. That was a campaign that involved, well, my boss, Tom McMillan, who's progressive conservative, enormous heavy lifting from Jim Fulton, late Jim Fulton, who was the NDP environment critic, but it was also his riding. Liberal Charles Catch. I mean, I could keep going on. Cross-party work to good effect. And John Fraser, who was at the time the Speaker of the House of Commons and a lifelong progressive conservative, referred to the fight to save South Moresby as the great conspiracy to save the planet. So I like conspiracies to save the planet. I like nonpartisan work. So in the last few months, we've created a couple of new caucuses. One is a multi-party climate caucus. That's probably one of the least likely that people would think we could do. We have an NDP, a lot of leadership on this. I thank Kirsty Duncan, who's the Liberal environment critic. She did a lot of the, logistics of getting everybody on board. But we have Denise Savoy, who's Deputy Speaker and a New Democrat member, and actually my neighbor, the neighboring riding of Victoria. And I'm in Saanich-Galfan. So Denise is on board as the NDP member of our all-party climate caucus, Kirsty Duncan for the Liberals, Maria Morani from the Bloc, and Michael Chong for the Conservatives. And we meet together and talk about what do we do to share more information, host events, talk about the issues, and try to find a place where we can actually have a conversation about the issue without it breaking down on partisan lines. Challenging, but really worthwhile. And another new caucus that we formed just a couple weeks ago is something that used to exist, interestingly enough, but fell into disuse and it just stopped existing, which is an all-party women's caucus of all the women in the House and the Senate. So it's quite cool, and we're now up to 25% women in the House of Commons. And with Nicole Turmel, I mean, obviously very tragic circumstances that led to Nicole Turmel being interim leader of the NDP with Jack's death, but Nicole Turmel is, we're seeing a sort of an ascendancy of more women's voices in politics with a number of new women premiers and so on. So it's a good time to have an all-party women's caucus. And our first rule when we met was, let's make sure that nothing we're talking about in this room is ever leaked. Everything we talk about in here is private till we can come up with something that we feel like talking about by consensus representing all of us. So that the work there is going to be exciting. And we also have an all-party international conservation caucus.
Yeah, you mentioned that. Tell me about that one. That seems like a very surprising one.
Yeah, well, we're looking at issues. I mean, I'm hoping that we might be able to look at a ban on shark fins. Shark fin soup is, for that one dish of shark fin soup, 90 million sharks a year die. So it's extraordinary. So we are seeing some support. Finn Donnelly, who's the fisheries critic for the NDP, has been talking about bringing forward a private member's bill, and I've been looking at a private member's bill. We'll see whether I support his bill or how we go forward, but we really do need to ban the possession and trade in shark fins in Canada. We already have condemned the practice of shark finning in Canadian waters. It's against Canadian law as a fisheries practice, but it's not against Canadian law to have shark fin and to have shark fin soup. So that's one aspect that we might do through this caucus or we might not. We're trying to decide, the caucus has primarily, it existed in the past, but it brought people in to share information with parliamentarians about international conservation work, about, for instance, the work of World Wildlife Fund or the plight of migratory birds, because it's 90% of the birds we have in Canada don't live here all the time. So they're sort of our birds, but they're also a lot of other people's birds. And so looking at it in an international conservation focus is certainly worth doing. And so that one we have a lot of enthusiasm for the caucus, so we're going to meet again soon. And the chair of that caucus, to give her credit, is a terrific Liberal MP from Vancouver named Joyce Murray. And it also has brought on board an old friend of mine from the NDP from Thunder Bay, Bruce Heyer, and the Conservative member of that caucus is a newly elected Conservative named Chris Alexander, who used to be our ambassador to Afghanistan. And he has a keen interest in international conservation issues. So get to know individual MPs as much on an individual basis as possible and see if we can build some common ground, because if we stand there screaming at each other for 4 years, nothing is going to change. And then we'll go into an election and goodness knows what will happen. And I'm just not prepared to squander the time between now and the election by, just continuing the partisan sniping in the House of Commons is just awful, and I wish I could end that. But it's I'm doing the best I can to encourage decorum.
I think it was Sun Tzu that said something like that the time that when you're confronting overwhelming odds, this is not the time to make a frontal attack. Or something. I mean,
it's the art of war. The art of war. Yes.
Yeah. And this sounds to me like clearly that's a lesson you've absorbed.
Well, it's satisfying as, rhetorical flourish to use my questions and question period to attack the government members just to say what a lousy crowd they are. But what's the point? I'm so far styling all my questions with an intent to get a real answer. And I also give the member of the government to whom I'm going to ask a question, I either send them an email or a handwritten note ahead of time to say, today I want to ask you about this. Now, other MPs don't do that, but I figure if I'm going to get a reasonable answer, there's no point pretending that I sort of a gotcha moment. I like to let them know what I'm going to ask about, and then once the response rarely qualifies as an answer, but once they've answered, then I just wander across the floor and sit down and chat a bit and further the discussion. So it's a good way of also engaging the government members, and I can't engage anyone if I've just said, will the minister admit he's a scurrilous, useless excuse for, some of the questions that the other members ask of government members, it almost makes you feel sorry for them, which, takes a lot for me to feel sorry for a government member. But if the question is premised by, sort of the style of question of when did you, have you stopped beating your wife kind of question, you think, well, that's not really helpful, folks. Let's try to figure out a better way to ask a question.
Do you find yourself still feeling quite desperate, or do these maneuvers, these sort of little apertures that you've been able to find, do they give you some reason for hope that maybe the situation, particularly environmentally, may not be as bad as what you had expected?
It's hard to describe my state of mind because I'm working so hard that I don't have any time for reflection. It's probably good. I've never worked as hard in my life. Where I feel most discouraged, strangely enough, is on the as I mentioned, the heartbreaking cases of people in my riding who are facing unbelievably cruel decisions, mostly from Immigration Canada, because we've stopped putting a priority on family reunification. Priority is on economic immigrants, people who are going to fill some kind of job slot. So I've got one woman in my riding, and I won't mention what country she's from, protect her confidentiality, but she, for reasons that make sense, go back and explain them, she was pregnant at the time she first applied to come to Canada. Family members, including her parents, were already here. They said, you can't apply for a child that's unborn. And then when she got her permission to come to Canada, she had a 3-year-old son. And they said, well, you can't bring him with you because you didn't apply for him when you applied. But once you're in Canada for a while, you can sponsor. So we now have a situation where this mom who's living in my riding has a 5-year-old living with relatives in another country, and the government has denied that he has any claim to live with his mother. They write this little 5-year-old letters, dear Mr. So-and-so, you don't meet any of the criteria to come to Canada. It's just, that's one. And I've got quite a few like that, whether they're husbands and wives who are separated, whether it's brothers who've been separated, and you think, why would we not want to recognize that these people should be together? And that's where I feel the most desperate, is on the constituency issues. I've got another constituent who had an accountant who is now being charged criminally for malfeasance, but the accountant took $500,000 of my constituents' money and wrongfully paid it into other people's accounts in Revenue Canada. So Revenue Canada owes my client $500,000. Do you think they want to give it my client? See, that's I've adopted my lawyer persona. My constituent is owned $500,000 by Revenue Canada, and their response is, we don't take any responsibility for this. It wasn't our fault. You can let the courts decide it. Well, it rather affects his ability to stay in business. You know, so these are the things. These are the ones that keep me up at night. The overall, strange, eh? The overarching disaster of the false majority government, the horror of taking this country into a tough on crime craziness where we're going to build more jails and keep more people in prison, and all of the big piece agenda items. I'm so busy fighting them in the House and feeling as though I'm making little bits of progress here and there that part isn't discouraging me. Strange. Yeah, I haven't really reflected on it till I started talking to you. But I really do feel encouraged by the fact I got elected and the fact that I'm not powerless in the House of Commons.
Well, it's interesting when you talk about what's keeping you up at night, because that in a sense is the power of story. I mean, it's one thing to talk about the overarching issue of the judicial bill, but that's in a certain level abstract. But
Yeah.
these are really concrete. These are specific
I feel
stories,
so
real
responsible
people.
to get action for people in my constituency who have been, I mean, I wish I could have gotten some of the cases, I wish I'd had them a year ago. It would have been so much easier to get action on them. So it's, if you really take it seriously, what your advocacy for people in your riding, that's a full-time job all by itself. Thank goodness I have great staff working on it locally.
One other big issue, but the comprehensive trade.
It's
Canadian,
well, you know, it
European
looks like
trade
it should be, but
right?
it's because it's a deal between Canada and the EU, and it's CETA, so you naturally think it's the Canadian, European, but it's actually the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, and it's between the EU and Canada, and the negotiations are highly secret. Nothing's come before Parliament yet.
And they would rather not, as far as I can figure out, have us even know that it's going on.
Oh, I think
right?
that's quite true. I mean, it would interfere with, well, it would drive up drug prices because it would provide greater patent protection for pharmaceutical companies. It would interfere with the ability of municipalities or provinces to have buy local programs, local procurement. You'd have to open up all local procurement decisions to the European Union, including for things like our waterworks, energy projects. That's a big market for European, Venti and all these companies that are involved in water. Then you've got the investor state provisions, which, I mean, it sounds very boring, investor state, but these are what we did in NAFTA that allows a foreign corporation to sue Canada if we, for instance, in the case of Ethel Corporation from Richmond, Virginia, they sued us because they made a neurotoxic gasoline additive called MMT, and Canada banned it. So they sued us because that was their loss. It caused them profits, and the way
theoretically, not real profits, theoretical profits.
No real
right?
profits, because they couldn't sell it in Canada, and they'd been selling it in Canada before.
Oh, okay. I'd forgotten the
Yeah. So but Metalclad, that was theoretical profits. That was a company in Mexico a U.S. company that wanted to build a waste dump in Mexico, or another company that won suing Canada was SD Myers of Ohio, is an incinerator company. Their claim was completely hypothetical. They said that because Canada banned the export of PCB contaminated waste from Canada, which we did under the Basel Treaty, which is a global treaty against the shipment and transport of hazardous waste. But one person's hazardous waste is another person's commodity. And SD Myers is a company that incinerates PCB contaminated waste, wanted Canadian waste, and said that the banning of PCB exports cost them profits. So they sued Canada and they won. And they got, I don't know how many millions of dollars from us. And it was astonishing because even at the time that SD Myers claimed that our ban on the export of PCB contaminated waste, denied them access to that material and hypothetical profits. At all material times, it was illegal under US law to import PCB contaminated waste. So sometimes the investor state provisions, to understand them, you really have to have a working familiarity with Lewis Carroll, because nothing.
I was going to say Franz Kafka.
Yeah, Kafka, but it's really a lot. It's an Alice in Wonderland world. You fall down the rabbit hole to begin to understand the S.D. Myers case. So to extend that in this Canada-Europe discussion would mean that all countries in the European, any business that emanated from any of the countries in the European Union could sue a Canadian town, city, province, or federal government if they didn't like a decision we made about anything. Labor practices, environmental practices, healthcare, anything that they saw as reducing their expectation of profit, real profit or hypothetical profit.
Now, it sounded, when I first heard about this, as though this was a train that was almost unstoppable, but you have some hope that the Europeans...
Funny about the Harper government, it's as if they're collecting trade deals, regardless of whether they've made a difference. They were trumpeting their trade deal with, Colombia, with its horrific labor records, but they had a trade deal with the European. There's a small little grouping of European countries, includes Liechtenstein and Iceland, European Council size, very small, about 3 or 4 countries. And that was the first European entity with which the Harper government some years ago got a trade deal. And they trumpeted it because it's just sort of collecting, saying we've got a trade deal with this country, a trade deal with that country. We're negotiating now with Mercosur, with trying to get a trade deal with Brazil. Mercosur is a very interesting trade bloc. I think it'll be a lot less malleable than the Europeans. But the hope for stopping the Canada-European trade deal does not lie, sadly, in the Canadian Parliament, because we don't have the votes, but in the European Parliament. And there are a number of European members of Parliament who oppose a trade deal with Canada on two grounds. One is our climate policy, and the other is our seal hunt policy. So, it's a strange world, but I think we need to educate Canadians about what's going on with that trade deal. We need to try to stop it within Canada. I'm very committed to that. But we also know that there are aspects of this comprehensive economic trade agreement that are extremely distasteful to Europeans, as well as Canada's environmental record, our asbestos. That's another reason they don't want to do a deal with us, because of asbestos. So there are a number of European parliamentarians thinking, do we really want to do a deal with Canada with all of these, black marks against us?
The interesting thing when you list them off like that is that these are all environmental issues.
Yes, that's true.
Right? From the perspective of the Green Party and the Green Interview, it looks as though there's a certain kind of beautiful symmetry about this, that these very issues on which Canada has been so appalling in recent years are likely to interfere with precisely what the government wants.
Exactly. I mean, it's really interesting too, the fuel directive that the Europeans announced, and then they postponed implementing it because of the aggressive lobbying from Canada. But they're saying, look, the tar sands crude has a much higher component when refined into gas and then burned in a car. The carbon content on the life cycle basis, because you go back to the fact you had to dig up the bitumen, it took a lot of energy to get it to be crude and so on, that the carbon content of the fuel is the highest in the European equations. It's a formula, it's science-based, it's non-discriminatory. It would affect tar sands crude out of Venezuela as well, because they have the same kind of bituminous sands as we have. But that has had a real jolt to the European trade negotiations, because the Europeans are saying, well, wait a minute, do we really want to do a trade deal because of the tar sands? Fascinating, eh? Yeah, you're right. Asbestos, well, asbestos is environmental and health. And Canada has a tremendously horrific reputation from this. And then the fuel standard on tar sands crude, and of course the seal hunt.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It's really nice to get caught up on all of this, and it's really interesting to get your reflections on what it's like once you're actually inside the House, as opposed to hoping to get there.
I really love being there. I'm going to say there's something about, I've worked there before, I've always liked the space. I like the building. I like being there. Strangely enough, the other night we had what's called a take note debate. and it was on what's happening to Coptic Christians and the wake of Cairo Spring, not quite what we would hope for, and persecution of Coptic Christians in Egypt. But it was just one of those moments where I'm quite often the only one who comes all day long and goes first thing in the morning and stays till the debates are over at night. And sometimes it's so funny, some of the other MPs around me, they have bosses who tell them they have to do house duty. So when they're there over and over again, they think, geez, you know, the house duty, I don't like house duty. So they looked at me, one of them forgot and said to me, well, you have house duty again? And I said, you know, I have the worst leader. I'm stuck with house duty all the time. I just keep getting sent here, you know. But I love being in the house. I love walking out late at night when there's nobody, you know, the security guards are always there. But the place is beautiful. The carvings are, you know, they speak of a lot of wonderful iconography of Canadian nature. You know, I look at the, you know, what's carved in the stonework and what's in the brass work, and there's moose and beaver, and there's, you know, and then there's First Nations iconography, and there's salmon, and I feel very at home in the House of Commons. I really wonder what all those other people are doing there who don't love it so much, but I really do. Somebody said to me, they said, you're here again? I said, yeah, they don't call it my house for nothing. I'm here all the time. So, yeah, I do like it, and thank goodness, thank the people of Saanich Gulf Islands, because they were really brave to send the first Green Party Member of Parliament to Ottawa.
Elizabeth May, author, activist, lawyer, leader of the Green Party of Canada, and Canada's first Green Member of Parliament. For the Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. Thanks for joining us.